Hey everybody, welcome back to Off the Couch with the Psych Guys. My name is Timothy Meyer, joined as always by Dr. Konstantin Lukin. How are we doing today, Konstantin?
We're doing well. I really like the topic that we're going to talk about today because I think it's just timely. I don't see a lot of things out there talking about it. So I think this idea that we're going to talk about is really going to be powerful for some people.
Right. So where this came up from, I do a lot of work with folks dealing with OCD, and I know Konstantin does too. And over this past week, I was speaking with someone who had a particularly challenging obsessive thought, and we'll get into that in a second. But really, the whole idea is that obsessive thoughts can be very strange.
They could very well be very strange.
Very strange. And in my conversation with my patient, he was saying, I wish there was something out there that would normalize the fact that a lot of these obsessions can be really bizarre. And I said, that's a great idea for us to talk about.
So first of all, thank you, whoever that is. And second of all, yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people... Right. Well, first of all, don't get me started about how people misuse I'm OCD about something when they organize their desk. But aside from that point, a lot of people think OCD is two things, right? Extra hand washing, right? And like touching stuff, right? Like doorknobs or extra time.
Or like rituals.
Or rituals or the most classic one. What was the movie with As Good as It Gets?
Never saw it.
Where the whole idea, he had pretty bad OCD. He's a writer, falls in love with Helen Hunt, yada, yada, yada. But like he would have to like step on like between the tiles, not touching the edges, right? Like, or the typical one was like hand washing. He would have to use every time he'd wash his hands, he had to get a new soap. Right. So I think movies out there, and I just think most people are not familiar. Like when they think OCD, they think hand washing and maybe some sort of a ritual around cleanliness.
Yep.
I think that's really where they are, but I'm glad that you're bringing it up. It's just because it's so varied. I spent a couple of years in an OCD-specific clinic, and you get to hear a lot of different things that are coming up for people. So I'm glad that we're doing it because I think for some people who are struggling with maybe, an OCD ritual, an obsession that's not common, that at least isn't necessarily talked about in the movies, might feel alienating, right? Like, what's wrong with me? Why do I have this thought? This sounds weird. And I know we'll get into more of what those things are, but just like to put that out there, OCD comes in so many different varieties. At least the obsessions really come in different varieties.
They really do. And so quick little facts about OCD. So obsessions, they're unwanted, intrusive thoughts. Right. So the thoughts that you don't want to have, and they pop up in your brain.
That's right.
They can be thoughts or beliefs or images or anything like that, right?
Right.
And then a compulsion is a behavior that someone does that relieves the discomfort or the disturbance that follows the obsession.
Right, temporarily. And that's where the obsessional piece comes in because it reduces it temporarily and then the obsessions get triggered again. So the person is, there's a tendency to do the compulsion again. So you could see how there's this sense of a trigger, an intrusive thought, there's something that's done to relieve the pressure, but unfortunately the obsession comes back and then the compulsion comes back and you could see how that could be a vicious cycle.
Yep, and that's exactly what it turns into, right? And so an obsession, right? It's an unwanted, intrusive thought.
Right.
And it could be anything, right? So let's dive into it.
For sure.
Some of the really uncomfortable ones that we've heard.
For sure. Well, first of all, I think just to pause in this, unwanted, intrusive, right? Unwanted, intrusive is another way of saying something that you have a particular flow of consciousness or particular thought pattern that you're having and that it interrupts, right? Interrupts, it encroaches upon, whatever phrasing works for you. But that's really the important piece here. And because it is what a lot of people refer to as a hiccup in the brain, at least some people tend to refer to it as that. It could be anything. I mean, I've heard things. I mean, let's start of the ones that are maybe uncomfortable, but are common for some women. It comes up right after delivery, the idea of hurting the baby, and that could be anything from strangling the baby to stabbing the baby to throwing the baby out the window or a garbage chute. Those are common ones that I know when I work with women in that period, postpartum period. Sometimes the OCD really spikes up, and those are, and you can imagine how frightening that could be, right? If all you wanted is to have a child, all you do is you care and you love a child, and all of a sudden these intrusive visualizations, images, right? Because it's not only thoughts. Imagine like having an image pop up in your mind, unwanted, to be able to hurt someone that you love so deeply, right? And what happens? The compulsion typically in those instances is avoidance.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And then obviously an enormous amount of shame and guilt.
Yes. So it's so I've worked with some of that too, and so I remember one woman in particular. She came in and she was so terrified and she was feeling so terribly about herself, like something must be wrong with me, like why in the world am I thinking about this, and really kind of like and we got to this kind of after session 1 or 2, kind of like really explaining like what an obsession is,
right,
was really helpful, like just right off the bat.
Right.
It's like you don't want to have this thought, you don't want to do this thing, and this thought is disturbing to you,
right?
And I say that's a good thing.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And it makes you feel really uncomfortable. So that's a hugely uncomfortable one. A lot of other ones that I've heard, I've heard a lot of sexual obsessions. So sexual thoughts about, gosh, it could be people with their family members,
right?
Sometimes their own children,
right?
I've heard of some about sexual thoughts about babies,
right?
And again, just to kind of clarify, every single person who I'm speaking about here was very deeply disturbed by these thoughts, right? It wasn't that they wanted to or that they found enjoyment from it. It was actually very disturbing, right? And so if you sit back and you think about it, it's like, oh my God, that is like some of the worst things that can pop into a human being's head.
It is very difficult, especially because it goes oftentimes, at least when I remember I was learning about OCD, it really attacks something that's so meaningful to you. Oftentimes, right? So like maybe caring for your kids or just welfare in general, and the intrusive thought is about hurting somebody, for example. Sexual is one, inappropriate touch, but also homicidal thought, right? Like killing somebody, right? Like, and that kind of creates also enormous amount of discomfort for people.
Yeah, I've worked with people who have had thoughts of, if they're cutting food, they just envision stabbing their child.
Right.
It's almost like you can't even imagine. So OCD, it's really like, I tell people I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy, because it's almost like insidious, right? It kind of like attacks the thing that you care about the most.
That's right.
And it gives you the worst image.
Right.
And then you sort of have to, or you feel like you have to do this compulsion to get rid of that feeling, but that compulsion that makes the obsessions come back more, and you find yourself in this loop of you're just trying to escape this this thought or this image or this obsession that makes you feel terrible.
Yeah. It's speaking of hurting, I remember a case where the person, every time they would cut a vegetable, the visualization would come in. They would just continue and start cutting their fingers and their arm. So that when they not panicking, like they avoided a good amount of things that they wanted to do because of it. So like these things can come up, right? Like, and I remember for this person, actually, cooking was sort of like a reliever of sorts, right? Like, so that then they avoided it. They wouldn't be able to do it because they had these intrusive thoughts that they would just continue. Let's say they're cutting up a carrot, they would just continue with the fingers, right? Like, so it just really oftentimes attacks something that's of value. And that becomes really challenging, because imagine the world can get really small real quick. Like, for instance, one gentleman that had, intrusive thoughts about inappropriate sexual touch with kids, right? Like, so then he couldn't go near schools, daycares, right? Like, the person didn't even go to church anymore. Like, so there's just like the life becomes relatively small because of this hiccup in the brain, right? And I just kind of want to highlight that fact, and I really like the way you said it. It's just it's an intrusive, unwanted thought, right? Like, and there's so many permutations in terms of what our mind produces in terms of thoughts, right? As you and one thing to remember, everybody has. There's research that over 90% of people have some intrusive thoughts, right? Like, because imagine, like, we don't control our thoughts 100% of the time. Like, I think we can all agree, right? All of a sudden we're driving and a tune pops up that we remember, right? Like, but we don't. If you think about it, the intrusiveness or the obsessional nature of it, nobody comes and says, you know what, I really like this song, and it just kind of got stuck in my head, and I replay it over and over, right? Because we get enjoyment out of it. right? So nobody comes in to talk about that because like, oh, I like that song. Yeah, maybe it's stuck in my head, but that's fine. It is when the negativity or the fear that comes in that people say, oh my God, no, I like the song to be replayed, but I don't like this to be replayed, right? But if you think about it, it's the same sort of loop-like nature.
Yep. Exactly.
Of OCD. So that really just to kind of one point to really hammer, if you're struggling with OCD and it might be not the one that you see in movies, just kind of see that the unwanted nature of it is really what delineates it from any other concern. And that, somebody who's seen a lot of OCD cases, and so did Tim, it really spans like across pretty much anything. I don't even know what it can attack.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It can really attack anything. And so my hope here, right, with this conversation, I'm hoping that, I'm hoping that people who are experiencing this are able to listen to this,
right? Because
what we're doing is we're normalizing it.
For sure.
We're saying like it's okay, like it's normal,
right?
And even if I'm not even. Sometimes what I tell people to do, the Y box, YBOCS questionnaire, about it.
Yeah.
I tell people, I give it to people, I administer it, but you can find it online. You can, look at the PDF, and you can find a very long list of common obsessions and compulsions. And that is usually really relieving in the beginning,
right?
With people. They're like, oh, like these sexual obsessions are actually like on this list, and I say, yeah, like because they happen, right? And then they're like, oh my gosh, okay, like I thought I was the only one in the world. Anyways, that's my long way of saying I'm hoping that this podcast can provide a little bit of psychoeducation, normalizing, and a little bit of relief for someone who might be going through it. Or if you're like my patient that I was talking about before, him trying to explain this to his loved ones.
Right. That's that's really important. Well, first, to your point, to acknowledge and accept and normalize that these things are happening for yourself, right? Like, because that hopefully helps with the shame.
Yeah.
That often is it. Because if it's me thinking these thoughts, then that says something about me, the type of person I am, right? The idea here would be to see it as an intrusive thought, right? Like, and especially if it comes up a lot of the time, it might cross over into like a disorder issue, which you would need help with. So just to kind of keep that out there, hopefully to help yourself. Listen, nobody wants to have these thoughts.
No.
These thoughts pop up. Hopefully normalizing it. And when it comes to talking to loved ones, hopefully if you're not feeling ashamed and you're seeing like, listen, for whatever reason, this hiccup in the brain is producing this, as we know, usually attacks things that we care about. Hopefully that makes it a little easier to at least have the internal comfort.
Yep.
We can't obviously control how even loved ones respond to it. But at least if we're feeling a little bit more comfortable, there's a sense of how we present it to others, rather than coming from guilt and shame.
Exactly. Yeah. I couldn't agree more.
Right. So it's, and that's, I think, you could even, to me, I like your suggestion, like, go look at Y-Box just to kind of see what's out there, right? Like you can, hopefully your family member, your significant other is at least a bit open to like learning about it before making judgments, right? Like you could show them this podcast. You could, could show them the Y-Box to see like these are, terrifying, but more common than one would think. And, maybe somebody who's not familiar with OCD and only sees it in movies like hand washing is like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. You don't wash your hands that much, or you're not that clean. What's the issue, right? They're going to make some judgments about the person's character. That's why we're doing it.
That's exactly what we're doing.
To kind of put that out there. That's not true. And imagine that it's also, like, for the family members out there, imagine that it's also super terrifying for the person experiencing it. Because it's like if you want to think about it, it's like an intrusive movie in one's mind that gets replayed without any control over it. So, just to kind of see it from that point of view, that it's not a characteristic or a personality flaw. It's also scary for the person who's experiencing, especially, as I've mentioned, it attacks something that people care about. So just to kind of a word of caution, or at least providing a little bit of empathy when you are engaging with somebody, a family member, a friend, whomever, that might be struggling with it.
Another big obsession that we hear about, but no one else hears about, a lot of times I've heard of men having the obsessive thought that they're gay.
Right. So HOCD, or homosexuality OCD, is also very common that comes up. And for a lot of men, that could be triggered in when they're teens, young adults, older adults. So it can kind of go across the lifespan. But that's also sometimes a very challenging one, especially for some people that I remember a couple of, they're married, they have kids, and all these intrusive thoughts are beginning to come for them, and that also provides just a scary experience, a confusing experience, also for a lot of the times there's also this sense of confession that needs to be done, right? And then they, sometimes they go to, let's say, church, or sometimes they tell their spouses, right? And let's say their wives are, sometimes understanding, sometimes not so understanding, right? Sometimes they make, this makes total sense, right? Like, then they come, they take and they run with it. So it's also a challenging one. I didn't want to kind of put that out there because it's more common than one would think.
Yeah, it is.
I just want to make sure, just to kind of put that out there, just for information. Again, these things happen. Again, the intrusive, unwanted thoughts that are coming up. So again, just for some of the viewers and listeners out there, again, as you can tell from this conversation, it could be anything and everything. And if you're struggling with something like that, really strongly suggest to reach out for help if needed.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it was perfectly said, and I think that wraps up for today.
Yeah, that's right. All right, guys. So again, if you are struggling with OCD and having these less, let's say less than in the movies type of OCD obsessions, feel free to kind of listen to the podcast, share it with anybody you think might be helpful. Again, you could do some internet research. Dr. Google knows it all, right? Like look up Y-Box in a PDF. You can kind of see, hopefully to help normalize it for you, to help yourself not feel as guilty or shameful about it. And hopefully that could empower you to have conversations with people that you love. And for the loved ones out there, again, try to think of it is that they're also scared, right, when these things are coming up for them. So just to kind of be able to see it that way, provide a little bit of empathy, even if they're sharing with you something that might be very difficult for you to hear. And that's why these conversations are so important and could be the beginning of healing.
Yep, perfectly said.
All right, thank you so much, guys, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.